Let's make the lead from Spider-Man 2099. You can download this preset along with several others at my Patreon. You can find a link to that along with several free preset packs in the video description below. Now before I jump into a step-by-step tutorial, I'll give an overview of this preset. Basically, we have two different oscillators that are doing two different things. So oscillator 1 is giving us a sustained sound like this. Oscillator 2 is giving us this fluttering sound like this. Then together they sound like this. So oscillator 1, that sustained sound, is just a saw wave going through a low-pass filter with some drive. Then oscillator 2 is basically a saw wave going through filter 2, and the cutoff of filter 2 is being rapidly modulated by this LFO over here. Then both of those oscillators are going to the effects section. The first thing we're using is a chorus effect, and this is giving us some variability in the amplitude of different frequencies, so that when we run that through the distortion gives us some grit and makes it sound more organic. Because without the chorus, it sounds pretty mechanical. Then after that, we're using a filter to just scoop up, because we're also doing some frequency modulation over here. So LFO2 is just scooping up the frequency of our oscillator by 48 semitones. So it's going from negative 48 semitones back to 0 semitones right here really quickly. Then after this filter, we're using an equalizer just to kind of match the tonality of the original. I was hearing a little bit more lows, a little bit more highs, and a little dip right here. Then over here, we're setting voices to 1 so that we can make it monophonic. We have legato turned on so we can glide between notes. We get that portamento by adding a little bit of glide time, and I changed the slope here to make it a little bit more organic and expressive sounding. Then, this is very important, I reduced the spread to about 15% here, and as a result, I didn't use the reverb in vital, because I don't want that spread to affect my stereo width of my reverb. So now let's dive into a step-by-step tutorial of this. To get started, initialize preset, we're just going to be using a saw wave for oscillator 1. We're going to run that through filter 1, so turn that on, turn down the resonance, and then set the cutoff here to 5. Then I'm going to use mod wheel to control the cutoff of that by 22 semitones. Then I'm going to give it a little bit of drive, so set that to 6 decibels. Then I'm going to open up oscillator 2. This is going to give us that fluttering effect. So this is pretty close to a saw wave, but I found something a little bit closer to the original using this wavetable found in Factory called Classic Fade. Now this is going to fade in between triangle wave, saw wave, square wave, and pulse. So I wanted something kind of in between a saw wave and a square wave, so I set this to 100. So now that I have that, I'm going to run it through filter 2, and this is going to give us that fluttering effect. I'm going to turn down the resonance here, and then I'm going to control that cutoff with an LFO. So set LFO1 to a shape like this. And then let's set the tempo to tempo triplets, and then go to 16th notes. So 16th triplets, but you might want to change this depending on the tempo of your track. So I'm going to drag that over to the cutoff of filter 2, and now I get this. Now I'm also going to control that modulation amount with the mod wheel. So that mod wheel is controlling how much this filter is opened up by the LFO. Now I'm going to adjust the envelopes here. I'm just going to give the preset a little bit of a takt time at 0.035. And then I'm going to set the release to 1 second. Then before I go to the effects section, I'm going to use another LFO to give us a scoop up to the sound that you hear in the original. So I'm going to set this LFO to a shape like this. I have the Y grid set to 2 so that it will snap to the middle here. And then I'm going to double click at a point here and then pull up on this to give it some slope like this. Now I'm going to set the unit to seconds. For this one, it's really fast, 0.15 seconds. And then the mode will be envelope. And then very important that you hold shift to make this bipolar and drag this over to the coarse pitch of oscillator 1. And now you get something like this. Now let's go to the effects section. I'm going to add in a chorus, and I'm just going to slow it down a little bit. 8 measures right here. Everything else can stay the same. And then I'm going to add in that distortion. So for this one, I'm just using soft clip, and then I'm going to drag mod wheel over to control the drive of this. And now we get that grit when I turn up the mod wheel. So now that I have a chorus, I want to limit the stereo width. So I'm going to set the spread here to 15, just to match the original. It makes it sound more like it's coming from a single source. Then I'm going to set it, voices to 1 so that it's monophonic. I'm going to turn on legato so that we can transition between notes without re-triggering envelope 1. And then let's add in some glide time. So for this one, I set it to about 0.125 seconds, and then I gave it a little bit of portamento slope here to make it sound a little bit more organic and expressive. And now we can glide in between notes. Then after that, let's add in a filter. We're going to set this to 24 decibels, turn down the resonance, turn down the cutoff all the way. Then we're going to use envelope 2 to control that cutoff. And this is going to basically just give us a little bit more natural of a scoop to the beginning of the note. So for this one, I'm going to set the attack time to 0.2 seconds. And then I'm going to pull down on it a little bit like that. And for this one, I'm going to set the release to 1 second as well. I'm going to drag this over to the cutoff. And now that kind of helps even out that scoop at the beginning of the note. Now after that, I'm going to use an equalizer to match the original a little bit more closely. I was hearing a little bit more lows, so for the low shelf, I'm going to set this to 3 decibels, turn down the resonance all the way. And then for the cutoff of this, I set this to 53 semitones. Then I'm adding a little band cut right here. For this one, it's -3 semitones. And the cutoff of this one is 105. And I just did this by ear and by looking at a frequency analyzer like span, going back and forth between my version and the original, and then tried to figure out what I was missing or what I had too much of, sliding these around until it sounded closer. So now I'm going to add in this high shelf. High shelf is going to get 3.5 decibels. And then for the cutoff, this one's at 114. And then the res is 25. So with a high resonance like that on the shelf, it's also cutting a little bit before that resonance, which is already where we have a little cut there. So now when I turn up the mod wheel, we get that high end back into the sound. So now that we've done that, I'm going to add in a few more modulations to the mod wheel. So this isn't very typical, but what I noticed in the original sound was that it was very expressive and very natural sounding. And it wasn't just doing one thing. There were a bunch of different phrases played by this sound, and they were all very expressive and different. The way I achieved that was by controlling amplitude as well as all of these modulations with the mod wheel. So I turned down the levels of oscillators 1 and 2, and then I'm using mod wheel to control them. So I'm going to set that modulation amount to 0.7 for oscillator 1. And then oscillator 2 is going to be a little bit more quiet, so I'm going to set this to 0.5. So now mod wheel is controlling the input gain. It's controlling the cutoff of filter 1, controlling the modulation of the cutoff of filter 2, and it's controlling distortion drive. So now we can really get a lot of expressivity with that mod wheel. And it might be kind of hard to do that live, so I actually just drew it in with my DAW. I'm using Ableton, but you could do this with any DAW. Basically, I just drew in the shape for the mod wheel, which is CC1 most of the time. So in Ableton, you can go into envelopes here, set this to MIDI control, and then make sure you're on CC1 right here, which is mod wheel. So then after that, I also used an external reverb. As I was saying at the beginning of the video, since the presets in mono are pretty close to mono, I didn't want the reverb to be in mono. I'm using an external reverb. For this one, I decided to use Valhalla Room. You could probably use just about any reverb if you get the settings right. So for the mix, it's pretty heavy in the mix, just a little shy of 50%. I took out the pre-delay, set the decay to about 3 seconds, and I left everything else the same. So anyways, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next time.